example, tomorrow when the wind chill here is minus 25, guess where our cows are going to be? They're going to be out in the spruce pine plantations that we call our living barns.
That's Brett Chedzoy, Cornell Extension Forester and co-operator of Angus Glen Farms in upstate New York, where he runs over 100 cow-calf pairs and has been ranching in Argentina since the 90s. Today, we're digging into silvopasture, specifically how to take existing woodland and open it up for grazing. This is the Grazing Grass Podcast for the grazer who wants more from their land, their livestock, and their life. I'm your host, Cal Hardage, because it all starts with the soil. Calling all ranchers, if you're looking for a better way to optimize your grazing operation and rev up your bottom line, Noble Research Institute can help. Noble's team of ranch managers and researchers work together to find solutions to your challenges. They don't just give you the answers. They help you understand how to apply their research-tested and field-proven principles on your ranch. Visit noble.org and click the Find a Course button for information about online and in-person educational courses near you. For 10 seconds about the farm, sometimes I wonder if the gaucho had it figured out all along. Just sit back and let the land and animals do the work. Brett, we want to welcome you to the Grazing Grass Podcast. We're excited for you to be here today. To get started, can you tell us a little bit about your operation and yourself?
Very good, Cal. I'm Brett Chedzoy. I'm a regional extension forester for Cornell University. As my wife and I like to joke, the other full-time job is our family's farm here in upstate New York, Angus Glen Farms, LLC. We graze about 600 acres with a little over 100 cow-calf pairs. And we've also been ranching in central Argentina, where Maria is from, since the mid-90s.
Did you grow up on a farm?
Both sides of my family were farmers up until my parents. My mom's family are Kansas wheat farmers, and some of my cousins still farm out there. And on my dad's side, my grandpa, Ernie Chedzoy, he grew up in a sheep herding family in South Wales. He came to the U.S., immigrated when he was 16 years old to work on a farm, and life took a different turn for him, and he wound up working in the local salt mines, but always had a small farm, which is where I spent much of my childhood. And my parents worked in other businesses. My dad is a funeral director. My youngest brother now owns and operates that funeral home. I, by the way, am a licensed funeral director as well, so I may be the only forester farmer funeral director you'll ever interview on this podcast. But my parents obviously had farming in their blood, and as kids we had a small horse farm growing up, and that was where I loved to spend my time. This was in the 70s and early 80s, before the days of MTV and PlayStation. So we just love to be outdoors. And ironically, in the mid-80s, I headed off to forestry school. And from that point forward, all I could dream of was planting the entire farm to trees so that I would never have to do small square bales again or do any of that hard farming stuff.
What attracted you to forestry school?
Growing up, I was always stuck at my dad's side. He was an avid hunter. So I remember I probably wasn't even 5 years old yet that my mom suggested that I go out hunting with Dad. He was going to go out grouse hunting, I think. And I remember him grumpily saying, "Oh, he won't be able to keep up with me." My mom made him walk across the living room floor, and it took me like a big leaping step to reach one of his steps. And I said, there, see, I can keep up with you. End of the story was that I got to go out hunting with my dad that day at probably 5 years old and never stopped going out hunting with him. But forestry really appealed to me because when you go off to college to be a this or be a that, I don't think we really comprehend what that means when we're heading out the door going off to school. But forestry struck me as something where I would be able to make a living being out in the woods every day.
Did you discover that love for the livestock in Argentina before you went to Argentina, or was it when you came back to the United States?
In a roundabout way, it was in Argentina, because when I went there in the early 90s, so after I finished graduate school in 1992, a month later I was on a plane heading to South America so I was in the U.S. Peace Corps, and this was a pilot program where the Peace Corps was looking to be more of a technical cooperation partner with these countries like Argentina and Chile. They weren't necessarily true first world countries, and they certainly weren't third world countries either. And we did our training for 3 months in Chile. One thing about the Peace Corps is that you do between 3 and 6 months of training. A good portion of that is, of course, language training and then cultural training, and just learn how to be an effective counterpart to whoever you're going to be working with on the ground. So we did our training in Chile. The program in Chile had just reopened. It shut down the 70s with their political issues, and Argentina had essentially been a closed country until the early 90s. And so the Peace Corps is a diplomatic program. And I think people not familiar, again, with the Peace Corps would think that, it's Americans going off to help people in other countries. And maybe some of that happens, but the Peace Corps tells you that there's 3 simple goals. One is for Americans to get to know other countries, people in other countries to get to know Americans, and then the exchange of ideas and knowledge and information, and essentially just becoming friends. And good things happen when you're out there working side by side. And so it's certain, I think that it would be rare where the situation where a Peace Corps person comes in and like they're the big shot expert, and the people are just standing there waiting to be educated on how to do something. I grew up in high school working for local loggers, and so I was good at the production side of forestry, the timber harvesting, and was proficient with a chainsaw and had chainsaw training. So they had requested a forester to work in this large provincial scale forestry project to train the gauchos. These were the ranch hands on these large plantations that were just starting to mature to the point where they needed to start thinning and harvesting trees. So I walked in there thinking I was going to just train all the gauchos how to be good loggers. The gauchos pretty quickly realized that logging was hard work and it was more fun to punch cattle on horseback. So I probably failed miserably in my objectives of training them how to be loggers, but I learned just so much from that experience. And the Argentines are very pragmatic farmers. I can't think of a single Argentine farmer I've ever met that I would say is like in it for the lifestyle or I don't like the word hobby farmer, but there is no such thing as a hobby farmer in Argentina. Everybody's in it to make a living from it, but they recognize that with that comes the responsibility to be good stewards of their land too. And they're very quick to pivot if there's a newer, better idea out there, or a better way of doing things. They're not really stuck in tradition. Now, you can look at farming as a whole in Argentina and fault them for plenty of other things. But they are very adaptive. They're very quick to take new ideas and run with it. And that made my interactions there a lot easier in a lot of ways, because they were looking for new ideas, was what it boiled down to. But everything they do, they have always a funny story attached to it. Like one day I spent a whole day laying out roads, logging roads up in the mountains, and I was so proud of my logging roads using my clinometer and all that. And the rancher comes out and he's, "Oh, those are nice roads." He goes, "Did you use the donkey?" And I'm like, "What do you mean a donkey?" I'm trying to think of, all right, what forestry instrument is a donkey? And he goes, "No," he goes, the burro. And I'm like, "What do you mean the burro?" And he goes, "We just turn the burro loose and see where the burro goes up the side of the mountain. That's where we put the road." I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, there is maybe a different way of doing things here."
I like that idea, just using the path the donkey makes and just go with that. Yeah, it's not quite as quick, maybe.
And one more quick story. So I would always zealously be saying, "Hey, if we buy this machine or this tool, we can basically produce so much more wood." And it was the same rancher. One day he pats me on the shoulder to tamper down my enthusiasm a little bit. And he tells me the story about the story is the engineer and the gaucho. So the engineer is driving down the road one day and he sees the gauchos sitting under the mesquite tree and a couple sheep in front of him. So he's, I wonder what that lazy guy's doing. So he rolls down his window and he's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" He goes, "I'm watching my sheep." And so the engineer gets thinking about it. And he's, "If you put up a little fence, then you wouldn't have to sit there all day and watch your sheep." And the gaucho keeps going, "Why would I do that?" And he goes, "If you don't have to watch your sheep, you can go get a job. Why would I do that? If you get a job, you can make more money. Why would I do that? You can buy more sheep." And this goes on and on. And so the engineer is getting more and more frustrated with the "why would I do that?" And finally, eventually you'll make so much money and you'll have so many sheep that you can pay somebody else to sit around and watch your sheep. And he goes, "What do you think I'm doing?" So I always keep that in mind when I sometimes wonder why we're doing what we're doing. Are we just trying to create a bigger ball of wax that we have to deal with, or should we just be sitting back and enjoying maybe the simpler, smaller versions?
I think that's a very real tension for a lot of people, and I'm sure I get caught up into that.
Yeah, our goal should be to sit under the tree and watch our few animals out there being
right.
Animals.
Yes. How long did you spend in Argentina?
My Peace Corps service was 2 years plus the training period, so I was there from 92 to 94. Maria and I got married in December of 94. I had finished my Peace Corps service at that point. The day before our wedding, I walked in the land lawyer's office with everything that I was able to beg, borrow, and steal, and plopped a big duffel bag of money down the table, and we bought our own ranch there. And this ranch was up in the mountains, not far from where her family's farm is, but they're mostly grain farmers down the flatlands. The foothills of the Sierra Mountains were up in the Sierra Mountains. And then we came back as poor newlyweds to the U.S., lived and worked here for 4 years stateside. The forestry consulting company that I worked for at that time was involved in a forestry consulting project back in Argentina. So in 1998, we moved back there. Our oldest son had just been born, so he was about 2 months old when we moved back to Argentina. Our youngest two were born there, and so we were there for 4 more years, from 98 to 2002. We moved back here in 2002. I think when we moved back in 98, we thought we would always be there long term, but if you follow Argentine politics, they seem to go through a boom-bust cycle about every dozen years, and in 2002 they were hitting a rock bottom. So it became, even though we had the ranch there, we wouldn't have had the means to really get it to the point where we wanted to have it. So we moved back to where I grew up here in the Watkins Glen area of upstate New York, and we felt this was a place where we would, when you have 3 under 3, all you're thinking about is having family nearby. So that I always joke that the first one was planned, the other 2 just came along. But we moved back here in New York because we felt it was the area that we could set our roots down and settle back to the old family farm here, which my parents had not been farming it. They had been leasing the farm, and we started to take a look around and ask ourselves, we're not going to be dairy farmers, and we're not going to be big row crop farmers. This isn't row crop country. So when you marry an Argentine, you start thinking about raising your own meat because they're going to eat you out of house and home. And it started out with just some sheep and goats, something small that we could do to have fun with the kids. And the cattle, we started with 2 cow-calf pairs in 2003 and just slowly grew to where we've been now for the past several years of about 100 plus pairs.
Let's talk about that area you settled back into, which is where you grew up. What's it look like for our listeners? What would we observe if we visited?
Watkins Glen is in the heart of what's known as the Finger Lakes region in New York. We have 5 deep, long glacial lakes. Watkins Glen is on the south end of the longest of those Finger Lakes, Seneca Lake. It's only 5 miles wide, but almost 40 miles long, and it's around 800 feet deep. So this lake doesn't freeze up in the winter time. It's a beautiful area of rolling hills and high ridges and deep valleys. New York, like most of the northeastern states, is covered mostly by forest land. New York's almost 2/3 covered with forest. But we do have a lot of agriculture here, mostly in the form of large dairies.
When you all headed back to New York, your family farm had been rented. Was it grazable acres? Was it forest?
Our farm, like many of the other farms in this area, was about half field and half forest. The field portions of our farm had been leased for around 15 years while I was largely off to college, that we didn't want to till the land up anymore.
When you think about when you all came to farm, you realize, hey, we don't want this erosion. We don't want to lose this soil. When did you implement what we call now regenerative practices, or that sustainable practices?
So looking around when we first moved back, as I started to say, the fields were already being farmed by somebody else. We gave them 5 years to phase out. That seemed like a fair and reasonable approach for them to get what they had invested. But it forced us into thinking about how we were going to turn our attention to the wooded acreage. And a lot of that wooded acreage was covered with noxious brush, a lot of non-native plants or invasive brush species like buckthorn, multiflora rose, honeysuckle, but barberry, you name it, we grew it and still do. And in hindsight, I think it was very fortunate that it worked out that way, because it forced us to turn our attention to the more challenging part of the farm, not the easier part of the farm. Had the fields not been under lease at the time, and these were just year-to-year handshake type leases, it wasn't like there was any real formal commitment there. But again, I believe in treating others the way I'd want them to treat me. So I don't want somebody yanking the rug out from under me in 1 year. We probably would have just put fences around all the nice fields and said, there, that's good. But we were already doing silvopasturing on our ranch in Argentina, which got me over those biases as a young forester that you could mix trees and livestock together. And I had experienced this being done very well and very successfully at very large scales on these large ranching operations that I worked with during the Peace Corps era. And then, of course, once we bought our ranch, we continued to maintain friendships with those ranchers and learn from them, and they helped us. Coming back here, I wasn't as intimidated by the thought of having animals out in what you would think of as non-traditional pasture-like settings as much as if I had not been exposed to that for the previous decade plus. And of course, you can put fence around your farm woodlot and turn animals in there. That's the easy part. But then you have to imagine a way that's good for both the animals and the trees. And that is, I call it the 3 easy steps of silvopasturing, which is thinning out trees so that you're moving more of that sunlight to the ground surface, getting the forages established, and then using the livestock as your 4-legged workforce to keep that moving in a positive direction, not just blowing back up into bad brush. So we can go into those 3 easy steps, and I say that with a big grin on my face in more detail, but that's what it boils down to, is that there's intentional and active management both in the tree side of it, the forage side of it, and the animal side of it.
Yes, Brett, I want to dive into those 3. At Redmond, we know that you thrive when your animals do. That's why it's essential to fill the gaps in your herd's nutrition with the minerals that they need. Made by nature, our ancient mineral salt and conditioner clay are the catalyst in optimizing the nutrients your animals get from their forage. Unaltered and unrefined, our minerals have the natural balance and proportion that your animals prefer. This gives your herd the ability to naturally regulate their mineral consumption as they graze. Our minerals won't just help you improve the health of your animals, but will also help you naturally build soil fertility so you can grow more nutrient-dense pasture year after year. Nourish your animals, your soil, and your life with Redmond. Learn more at redmondagriculture.com. Maybe we should put it in quotes, easy steps, and go through that. And I believe the first one you mentioned was thinning your trees.
Yeah, so let me back up one more step and say today we recognize that there's 2 main directions from which we can approach creating silvopastures, or the practice of silvopasture. People tease me because I'm always talking about silvopasturing, and that's a mouthful. But silvopasturing would be the doing it part of having silvopasture. You've had my friend Austin Unruh on, I believe, 3 different times, and he's talked about the other direction, which is we call it silvopasture by addition. We're adding trees into a pasture-based setting in an area that may have no trees or just scattered trees, but we recognize that the trees are going to give us and our animals and the land good stuff, so we need to add more trees. The silvopasture by subtraction is where we already have plenty of trees there, but we need to manage those trees in a way that we can have more forage and more productive grazing for the livestock. So we're going to talk about the silvopasture by subtraction side of silvopasturing today. On our ranch in Argentina, by the way, it's all been silvopasture by addition. Forestry or silviculture, by its definition, is sustainable in that we then regenerate or replace those trees and repeat that cycle again. Silvopasturing, though, we spend so much time and this area and probably everywhere talking about rural economic development. Well, here's this very, very ripe opportunity in our own backyards where we could turn easily many hundreds of thousands of acres and potentially millions of acres into productive grazing land and have it really be a win-win for the land, the livestock, the farmer, and the rural community.
So if someone's listening and thinking about doing this, it can feel a little overwhelming at first.
We, like as foresters, we understand the forestry side. As grazers, we understand the grazing side. Grazers tend to get a little intimidated by the forestry principles behind silvopasturing. The good news is you don't necessarily have to have a degree in silviculture to understand everything that you probably ultimately would want to know about how to manage the trees or the wooded component of your silvopasture. There's often forestry professionals out there, be it like state foresters or soil and water conservation district foresters. Not a whole lot of extension foresters out there, but we're out there. And then, of course, the private consulting foresters. So we could have the best of both worlds. We could have all that stuff, plus have more land available for sustaining our livestock. So the very first thing that all farmers or ranchers should ask themselves is, how much of this tree-covered portion of my land am I interested in creating silvopasture on? Maybe at the end we'll talk about resources, but we've developed again, I like the quote-unquote easy steps. So we have this 10-question questionnaire that any farmer could take out and look around, and it's essentially a site evaluation criteria for, is this land suitable for silvopasture? I think any land that can support forages and trees is potentially suitable for silvopasture, and that you, of course, could get water and a fence around. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be worth the investment of time and money to create silvopasture. So if you're like on a trap rock ridge or exposed bedrock where the grazing days are going to be very low, you can still manage this as silvopasture, but it may not offset what you're going to put into that to do that. So let's say that we go out and we make some assessment of that land and we realize, okay, this is like growing on similar site quality or soils, or I've got reasonable access here. It's checking all these boxes, or it's ranking well for these 10 questions that we would think through. The next step is you would have to ask yourself, can I do this myself, or do I need the pros to come in here with the heavy metal and make mountains of trees disappear? And just cutting trees down is probably not enough, because everybody on this podcast has probably cut trees before, and you realize that those trees make quite a mess on the ground when you cut them down. And that's counterproductive to what we need to do next, which is graze it, manage it in a way that we can have more of the good stuff, what we think of as our palatable forage plants, and less of the noxious weeds and brush that also want to utilize that sunlight and fill that void, those little voids that we're creating. And I think that it's very fine and reasonable for every farmer to ease into silvopasture through the DIY approach of maybe attempting to create their first acre to a silvopasture on their own, because it'll teach them a lot of things and help move them along a critical learning curve that would prepare them for that next level, which would be working with a professional forester and then timber harvesting professionals, aka loggers, to come in and harvest trees at a much larger scale, and not just harvest the trees, but utilize a good portion of each tree that's harvested so that you're managing the residues that we're leaving behind the ground. Logging residues are known as slash, so slash management is a really important step in creating silvopasture in wooded areas. If we just go through and do the standard saw timber type timber harvest, but we have these large tree crowns laying on the ground, even if they're lopped down, which is a common practice in logging, it just makes things look prettier. It doesn't serve any other real purpose. We've now created like little refugia for all the noxious plants to just shoot right back up through, where the animals can't reach them to browse them or trample them. And trampling, by the way, is in most cases going to be the more effective approach to controlling the noxious plants than browsing. Browsing would have, like in that Goats in the Woods project I mentioned earlier, that was in essence mob grazing with goats in electronet paddocks. And this was like Cornell was way ahead of their time. I say it jokingly, but nobody was quite talking about mob grazing yet in the year 2000. Maybe we were, but certainly not with goats and maplewood sugar bushes. And the reason that we had to mob goats up in small electronet packs was that you needed to create that mob grazing mentality by the goats. The goats weren't trampling the target plants, because the target plants were sapling size woody trees and shrubs that they were much taller than the goats were. But what the goats would do is that they would be supplemented with a low fiber diet that caused them to crave fiber that they were finding in the tree bark of these small ironwood trees or buckthorn trees, or I'm not going to get into all the different species, but then the goats would very effectively strip the bark off those trees, and then you would hit it again a year or two later, because you would have those trees try to resprout below the girdle, and then usually by the second time you did that, that was enough to cause those undesirable small woody plants to die. And it was effective, and it was even cost effective, but it was very labor intensive. And we all, I think, know the joy of trying to set up electronet in wooded areas.
Oh, yeah.
To do that at a relatively small scale. So our origins of silvopasturing here were more for vegetation management objectives. And today, of course, I think vegetation management is still a big part of it, but first and foremost, we're thinking of silvopasturing, an expansion of grazing opportunities on an abundant land resource that is part of most of our farms, probably almost all of our grazing farms here in the Northeast. But it's much more than that too. It's also about, for example, tomorrow when the wind chill here is minus 25, guess where our cows are going to be? They're going to be out in the spruce pine plantations that we call our living barns. And those plantations that we planted here 35 plus years ago, not knowing at the time that they were going to be our future living barns, it was just, we wanted to fill in the nooks and crannies of our farm with trees, and it was easier to plant conifers in many cases than it was hardwoods, because the conifers you could just basically plant and walk away from and they would survive. The hardwoods needed much more tender loving care. These aren't large plantations. They average from like an acre to, I think our largest is 6 acres, but we have them scattered around the farm. And these are areas that, despite the name, the animals are not in there for any extended period of time. The hard part of outwintering a large beef cattle herd is you watch the 10-day forecast, and when you see that the polar vortex is coming along and it's going to be miserable, and maybe our cattle, they're totally fine with that type of temperature, but they do, I think, appreciate the opportunity to get their faces and heads out of. We're expecting snow squalls on top of that, so they don't want their faces being pelted by granular like snow when it's minus 20 wind chill. They want to be able to move in and get a little respite from that. Those are areas, though, that we carry with, put a little extra better quality hay in there, and then as the ugly stuff approaches, we can anticipate that several days out, move the animals towards one of those living barns. We are still thinning and managing those living barns similar to as we would as with a silvopasture, in that you have to periodically thin the lower quality trees out there to maintain the growth and vigor of your better trees on that site. If you don't, then you just get this stand of dense trees that over time declines and is more susceptible to pest outbreaks, or if you get wind throw in there, you get the domino effect. We aren't necessarily trying to grow a lot of forage, though, in the understories of those living barns. But living barns would be just one more example of an extension of what we think of as silvopasture. And I know that to build a very rudimentary pole barn structure on our farm today that we could put the animals in for even just days at a time, if we were to follow the NRCS standards, it would be at least a $400,000 investment. And I'm talking about something with no concrete, probably no walls, just a giant pole barn that would be about the size of a football field. And that just doesn't pencil out for a beef cattle farm. Our living barns have helped us forego expenses that huge investments that we probably would have otherwise made. It helps the animals, and I sleep better at night knowing the animals are going to be out there cozy in their living barn for the next couple of days.
I really like the idea of the living barns, and I hadn't really thought about it much. And if you talk permaculture, they're big about living barns in some structure, maybe a little bit different than yours. Grassroots Carbon partners with ranchers to strengthen working lands and restore soil health through regenerative grazing. Across more than 2 million acres in 22 states, they're improving water cycles, rebuilding grasslands, and delivering verified, nature-based carbon removal. Their mission is simple: keep the cowboy on the ranch and carbon in the soil. Learn how healthy soils can power resilient ranching and measurable climate impact at grassrootscarbon.com. But I want to jump back to talk about Silvopasture and someone wanting to create it. You mentioned a 10-question questionnaire site evaluation. Is that a document that people can access, like on the Cornell website or somewhere?
Yes, it is. The easy way to find any of the stuff that I may mention today would be to type Cornell Silvo. That will direct people either to the Cornell Small Farms website, where we're trying to move a lot of this information over to, or to our forestry extension website. That's the website address is a little complicated. It's forestconnect.info. A lot of our extension sites are .info. But again, I would search for it under Cornell Silvopasture or Cornell Silvopasture. We have that site evaluation questionnaire there. There's two parts to that, by the way. There's the 10 questions that you would subjectively rank, like accessibility, water, site quality, existing. You don't need any special tools or instruments or soils maps to answer these questions. It's something you just carry out there with your eyeball, and you give it a 1 to 10 score. And then there's a second part to each of those questions, which is, so if it ranks low, is there a fix to it, and what does it cost? So let's just say that the site that you're interested in developing into silvopasture has no good water source. We do this all the time as grazers. Like, we fix that problem. We pipe water in, or we develop an on-site water source. And so you're gonna add it all up at the end, you're going to have two pieces of information. You're going to have this subjective score, which if it scores high, then it's okay, this site has good potential. If it scores low, maybe it's not where I want to start. Maybe eventually I'll get to considering developing this area into silvopasture, but maybe I want to spend my money and time on a different part of the farm today. And that's also going to identify those critical bottlenecks and what it would cost to remediate those bottlenecks.
With someone goes through that, and I think that's very important to consider those questions, to think about if there's solutions to them, to have some kind of plan and thought pattern to go through rather than just jumping into the deep end without knowing anything about it. So they go through that and they say, this is a good candidate. There's potential for silvopasture in this area. What should they do? I know you mentioned thinning. Is that something they bring someone in, or is it something they can do themselves?
I think we all think we can do it ourselves, but nobody should underestimate. All farmers are guilty of thinking, I'll just find time this winter to go in there and do the amount of tree removal that's needed. But our major silvopasture harvests here on our farm have all been done by professional loggers, and it's because I recognize, and we've really enjoyed managing our woods and cutting firewood for almost 40 years that we've had this farm, but I wasn't making a dent in what needed to happen.
Progress,
and
yes.
The opportunity cost became higher and higher as our herd grew and grew, and by embracing the silvopasture, we still have our forest, but we now use that forest for much more than what we would have used it for had silvopasturing never been part of the picture. And forest, obviously, besides a very aesthetically beautiful landscape and great habitat for the wildlife and just a nice place to go out there and hunt and do other things, it's also, trees are typically a valuable commodity, and we're in the epicenter of the world's most valuable hardwood forest region here in the southern tier of New York, and that crosses over into the northern tier of Pennsylvania. Nearly all of the hardwood saw timber that is harvested here is directly exported overseas, and we have several very, very large sawmills. The largest, I believe, in the eastern United States are all within a short radius of our farm. So these are world-class oak maple forests and many other valuable species mixed in. So we have to do it in a way that's protecting that very valuable resource, and not just protecting the trees that are there today, but in a way that we can, again, periodically regenerate or establish new cohorts of trees. I want to throw in one brief forestry concept, and I'm really trying hard today to not put my extension forester hat on and talk too much about silvicultural principles, but again, I think a common misperception is that we can have this continuum of age classes in a typical woodland, and if you're talking about the relatively open, more savanna-like looking woodlands, like I believe your most recent episode with Jacob, what I picture there when I hear about like large crowned oaks and lots of space between trees is more of that savanna-looking type silvopasture.
Savanna type.
Here, it's like forest primeval looking type forest. There's just a way too much tree density is our more typical starting point. So we need to reduce that density of trees, and we need to do it in a way that's favoring the better trees and that we're removing the lower quality trees. I said earlier that silvopasturing for us is like this decision between, do I want to grow firewood in my woods or do I want to grow forage? And if I remove a lot of those firewood quality trees, I can again reallocate that sunlight not just to the crowns of the better trees I'm leaving in the upper canopy, but also move it all the way down to a portion of it down to the soil surface so I can grow productive cool season forages. And many of our cool season forages here, orchard grass being our predominant species, but even some of the clovers have moderate shade tolerance. By their very definition or nature, they actually grow better in light shade than they do in full hot sunlight. So that's where some of this synergy comes in with silvopastures, is that you have maybe a little bit less solar energy reaching the ground, a little bit less photosynthesis, but you get that prolongation on both ends of that cool season forage growing peak, where the days where it's hitting mid-80s and the cool season grasses are starting to senesce in our treeless pastures, it's 10 to 15 degrees cooler and usually moister in our silvopasture understories, so that grass continues to grow perhaps into mid to late June versus only early June. Same thing happens in the early fall period. And then the green up is also typically about a week earlier in our silvopastures, because you're not getting that late winter heavy like frost exposure that you would out in a treeless pasture. The trees are blocking a lot of that irradiation from the cold night skies. You'll have light frost out there in perhaps early May, and you'll have no frost under your silvopasture understories. A lot of those sort of like climatic benefits are probably the biggest benefit that many grazers are interested in with the silvopastures. But your recent conversation with Jacob, he was talking about a lot of the landowner interests around wildlife habitat. I think silvopastures are the ultimate wildlife habitat. In forestry school, they would teach us that wildlife want two things. They want food and they want shelter. Well, silvopastures are giving us both of those in abundance. And they also would teach us that edge habitat, that meeting place between field and forest, was also the habitat type that was the most important to the greatest number of wildlife species. Silvopastures are really extensive edge habitat. It's a little more complex than that, but it's a relatively rare or uncommon habitat type here in the Northeast, where again we've either removed all the trees for more traditional type farming, or it's just relatively unmanaged dense woods. And silvopastures really do have that more savanna-like appearance. And it can be more trees or fewer trees. We don't need to get hung up on just what that residual density of trees is, but we are intentionally managing that residual density of trees, that we're getting enough sunlight there to grow enough forage to make it work as a productive and effective grazing system. Now, there's a whole bunch of silviculture, forest management science that goes into that, calibrating exactly can go somewhere else. That access to those markets is going to require a forester that has the contracts or quotas or contacts to market that kind of wood. And again, it's not the same kind of logging operation that would just show up and cut 100 big oak trees on your farm. The one that's going to show up and cut 10,000 firewood quality trees on your farm, that looks like a very different crew of equipment and mindset than the ones that focus more on just high value, high quality saw timber type trees. So,
a quick question before we transition to Famous Four. You mentioned that forestry professional numerous times. In your area, or in our listeners' area, would the best place to go to find that person be a land grant university, or Or how would they go about finding them?
Here's where I would start, and it's going to be a little different in every state, but I would first go to your land grant university, see if they even have a forestry extension department. The eastern states, the answer is probably yes. You get over your way in the Midwest, maybe not. I would also concurrently look to see if there's a state forestry agency. Again, in the eastern U.S., probably yes. Like in Oklahoma, maybe more of like a Department of Natural Resources, and they might have a handful of people in there with forestry backgrounds. And then thirdly, I believe pretty much every county in the U.S. has a soil and water conservation district, and many of our soil and water conservation districts here in New York have a person with a forestry background or access to somebody with that expertise. So those are all good starting points, I think, to try to identify the person that could then actually come out to your property and take a closer look and help you with those next steps. Those next steps here in New York, I would always encourage any sizable grazing farmer to think about even starting with what we call a forest management plan, and then write the silvopasturing objectives in there, because it's going to give you the bigger, fuller picture of what your forest land entails and how you're going to take steps over a number of years to reach that desired vision that you have in your head of what you want, whether it's, again, for forest or silvopasture or some combination thereof. And the one thing that I just thought is something that I always joke about when I'm talking to farmer audiences about silvopasturing, and that is that farmers typically want everything to happen in one growing season, and foresters are excited when it happens in 50 years. So you got two different time scales of there, say 5 months versus 5 decades. And silvopasturing is an agroforestry system, is this hybrid between agronomy and silviculture. So we need to recalibrate whether we're coming at from this forestry side or the farming side. We need to understand that this reaching whatever our desired end conditions are is something that may take more than a few years. But as a forester, I would have a hard time getting a farmer on board with a project where they may have to wait decades and decades to get to where they want to be too. And that's a question of, do we need to make bigger investments for more instant gratification to get there sooner rather than later? On our farm, it's been more the slow and steady approach, which as a forester, I can afford to do, in part because I know through my experience that I'm moving in the right direction. But if I didn't have that 35 plus year career now, forestry behind me, as a farmer, I'd probably be like, I want to see lots of grass and lots of grazing in 5 years. And in that case, I'm probably going to need to do things above and beyond what I might just be able to accomplish in the slow and steady approach. The slow and steady approach is, of course, the Tom Sawyer approach. Of loggers come in, do the thinning work for me, and they pay me for it. Whereas that above and beyond might be, I'm going to do the logging, get the bulk of it taken care of at least a break even, probably at a net profit, because timber is valuable if you market it the correct way. But then I may have to do some of those additional follow-up things, like go through with a forestry mulching machine and grind up the stumps a little more, grind up some of the invasive shrub understory that I couldn't get the loggers to cut with the big forestry machines or run over.
Brett, it is time for us to transition to our famous 4 questions. Same 4 questions we ask of all of our guests. Our first question: what's your favorite grazing grass related book or resource?
Since you were foolish enough to invite a forester on, and we're talking about, I think, a forestry themed topic of silvopasturing today, I'm going to be a little bit contrarian, and I really enjoy these questions that you've asked of your other farmers, and I find myself nodding my head to all those great books and resources that they've mentioned. But one that I'm going to, since it's my turn, I'm going to bring up a name in a book that maybe is less familiar to a lot of the listeners, and that would be Aldo Leopold in a Sand County Almanac. Aldo was an early American forester and conservationist who a lot of his writings were based on his farm in Michigan. There was basically your typical Dust Bowl era rundown farm, and he rehabilitated it through planting trees. And the reason that I have been so inspired, it's really a mandatory textbook when you're in forestry school. I think Aldo has been credited with at least 4 or 5 books, and then there's been other books that based on his life and work. But every time I've read that book, which has been quite a few times over the last almost 40 years, I just take pause and I remember that there's a whole side of our farms and what we do as farmers that extends way beyond the production side or the how many head of livestock we have side or grazing days side. And Aldo had I think, unmatched ability to show the natural beauty in our farms. And one of my favorite quotes from, I believe it's from Sand County Almanac, but it was actually Gene Garrett at University of Missouri that I first heard use this quote. The quote is fairly long, but it talks about farms as a food factory versus a beautiful place that we call home. And I never want to lose sight of that beautiful place that we call home side of our farm and why we do what we do here. So if anybody's looking for a good winter book to read, I would try to find a copy of the Sand County Almanac and read it, because he had a poetry and the ability to observe even the little mundane things and express it in a way that I think not only maybe the most experienced forester or ecologist would understand, but somebody off the street would understand as well.
Excellent. I have not read that book, and I hear about it occasionally. I'm not even sure I have that book, so I'll have to do some looking on that. But I appreciate the selection or the suggestion.
Probably nobody's brought that one up before. And be your own judge, but that, to me, has always been a very impactful and inspirational book.
Oh, yes. And I love getting books that maybe are not top of mind for a lot of guests, something a little bit different. For our second question, what's your favorite tool for the farm?
I'll be much more cliche with this answer, and I've heard some great answers to this question. I think we would be lost without our 50-horse four-wheel drive compact tractor here on this little grazing farm. It is the workhorse.
Oh, yeah.
And we have all the big iron, because unfortunately we're in a situation where we have to make our own hay here. If I were to go out and try and buy hay on the open market here, I'd probably be able to find roughly half of what we use. The realities of beef cattle farming here in the frozen north is that you're going to feed hay. You're going to feed a significant amount of hay, and kudos to all those out there doing the year-round grazing and striving to do the year-round grazing. But even our very, very top grazers in this area, and I don't put myself in that category by any means, are barely clipping 300 days of grazing a year. On our farm, our goal is to graze 8 months and rotationally bale graze for 4 months. So we're usually fully grazing by mid-April, which is at least 2 or 3 weeks earlier than any of our neighbors. And then we're in a normal year, which there's never a normal year anymore. We're usually grazing off the last of our stockpile in mid-December. And mid-December is when we typically start getting covered up with concrete like snow, and orchard grass doesn't stand up very well to that kind of stuff. And it's also usually mud season conditions. But if we don't lease an acre of land around us to grow hay on, it quickly turns into homes or cornfields. So and it keeps my 85-year-old dad out of trouble. He loves raking hay, so God bless him. As long as he wants to be out there, I'll keep buying the $100,000 plus cab tractors and pricey hay equipment for as long as it keeps Dad young and busy and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So that little compact tractor, though, is just amazing to put a spear on the front and the back of it and move 1,000-pound high-density round bales around and put them right where we want it. We love bale grazing in our silvopastures in the winter because kind of knock out those last little remnant patches of soft brush. If you put a 1,000-pound round bale in the middle of the multiflora rose patch or the blackberry canes, if you do the math, you're getting over 1 million pounds of density per acre of cattle standing around that bale, and it's a sustained density as they stand around that bale for several hours devouring it, and you're getting the fertilizing and the reseeding that usually comes with our late first cutting hay. All the orchard grass here is usually already setting a mature seed head by the time we can get on our fields in early to mid-June. So we might as well be using, I did some math once. I figured that we were getting somewhere between $50 and $100 worth of free forage seed per 1,000-pound round bale, and putting it out there where we still need more forage, and having the cattle just trample and smash the multiflora rose canes or something. And this time of the year, the cattle want to be in there rubbing and on all that prickly stuff anyhow. In the summertime, when they've got their nice little neoprene suits on, they probably don't want to wade into the thorny stuff as much. This time of the year, they're going to be over there rubbing and itching on all that anyhow. So it's a great way to not only put the fertility and forage out there where we need it, but beat back the bad brush that, because silvopastures, you can't just go in and fix your poor grazing with the usual tools like a brush hog or spray rig, and you gotta rely almost entirely on that really A-game grazing and livestock impact to keep gradually shifting it more and more towards that nice, stable, diverse, herbaceous understory, and not have it just blow up into head-high blackberry canes or brush.
Yeah, tractor's a tremendous resource. I love, if I'm putting a bale of hay out in the pasture for the cows, I look for a blueberry patch. There's especially on the lease land, there's some areas there that I know right where I'm going to put the next bale of hay so I can get that impact, and hopefully they trample out some of that and I get more grazing.
Yeah, you watch what comes up a season after you feed a bale somewhere, especially in a like a wooded type area where it's not that the fertility isn't there, it's just you don't necessarily have the biology going on there to have it really express productive forage. But we have all these little green oases scattered throughout our newer, less developed silvopasture areas of where we've done. And the cows are very happy out in those wooded areas in the winter. It just gets them out of the wind a little bit more. And it is one of our advantages here. We have a long winter, but we also have a lot of frost in our ground in a typical winter, so we can go out there this time of the year, do heavy bale grazing, and have literally no impact to the tree roots or the soil compaction.
Oh, yeah. Our third question, what would you tell someone just getting started?
I wish I could start over again today, knowing what I know. It would have saved me a lot of money and time with things. And I feel that so many farmers are so generous sharing their experience and knowledge with others. So my advice would be to seek out those that are doing things that seem to match up with what you want to do. And this would be particularly important with something like silvopasture, whether, again, you're removing trees or adding trees. If you're going to plant trees, by the way, I consider that a much more challenging direction from which to create silvopastures. And you and Austin have had some great conversations around that. But one of the frequently asked questions is an extension forester, somebody that's going to plant trees, and they call me up and say, what do I need to know? And I'm like, I'll tell you what, go buy your first 10 trees, first 50 trees, whatever. Don't buy more than a bundle or two of trees. Plant them, keep them alive for a year, then call me, then we'll have a conversation. Because I can't possibly tell you what you need to really know until you've done that. Which would be, so to the extent that we can, again, jump ahead on somebody else's learning curve, and you're not going to avoid all the pitfalls or all the mistakes by doing that, but you can certainly save yourself some grief and angst. And the flip side of that, though, is I don't feel that there's any real substitute for experience. And by that, though, I'm really saying is that at some point you're just going to need to roll up your sleeves and do this stuff. And that would be a key message for today's conversation on silvopasturing, is that don't set yourself up for the 50-acre train wreck by just going in there and lay waste to a bunch of trees in your woods and then realize you just didn't quite have the livestock workforce to help you keep up with what happens next, or you have sea of logging residues out there that don't work in your favor. Let's put it that way. Ease into it. But yeah, I think, like with all things, if any of us can think back to when we grazed animals for the first time, and for some of us that happened in adulthood, and some of us it happened maybe in early childhood, but how intimidating that seemed, like, oh, how am I going to keep these animals inside the fence and keep them alive and move them from here to there? But after about, I've taught 2 grazing related courses for Cornell University for years. I've since handed both of those courses off in the last year. I find it humorous that they asked the forester to teach the beef cattle management and grazing management courses, but I really enjoyed teaching those online courses. And so many of my students they knew that they needed to learn something before their first animal showed up. And then I would cross paths with them a year or 2 later, or maybe several years later after they took the course, and they come up to me and say, hey, I took your course, and yeah, I got my first 5 cows or my first 10 sheep or 4 pigs or whatever. And you could tell that they, after 1 year or just one, like their first experience, they were in such a different place than when they started out and hadn't done that.
Yeah. Our excellent advice there. Find someone doing what you're wanting to do so you can learn from them, maybe shortening your learning curve, and then get started. Our last question, where can others find out more about you?
My wife likes to remind me that it's my job to talk to people. Yeah, I feel like I have the best job in the world as an extension person, because, funny story, when I took this job almost 20 years ago, I was hemming and hawing about whether I really wanted to do this. And to be honest, I didn't have a good understanding of what extension really did. And as I'm sitting there kind of arguing with myself, my wife looks at me and she didn't quite call me dummy, but it was like she's, what are you thinking? It's all you do is talk to people all day long about their trees and their woods, and now they're cows. It's like, why wouldn't you want to do that, Chop?
Oh.
So I'm real easy to find online. You have my email, and my cell phone there was in my email, and you're welcome to post that. I will warn everybody that I really do want to talk to you, but just because you send me an email doesn't mean I'm going to see that email or be able to respond to it right away. So if anybody does try to reach me and I don't quickly respond to the voicemail or email, just try again, please. Once in a while I get, because I really pride myself on spending most of my time out in the field doing applied research and managing our forests, which are all basically research and demonstration projects, not sitting behind my computer all day. So just be a little bit patient, be persistent, but by all means reach out. And I don't think I can't tell everybody in an email or a phone conversation, or certainly not a text message exchange, which texting is fine too. I'm not going to be able to tell somebody everything they need to know about Silvopasture. What I am going to probably do is refer you back to, there's a lot of great information out there, starting with land grant websites, including our own at Cornell.
Oh, yes.
But the National Agroforestry Center has a lot of good information on silvopasturing. University of Missouri, they're the flagship land grant for silvopasturing information. I would look for, it's always said the principles really don't change. The methods do, but the silvopasturing principles are going to be the same whether you're doing it in Oklahoma or New York or Texas or Minnesota or somewhere else. It's again finding that right balance of trees so that you can have the right balance of forage to go with it, and understanding how those trees, what the animals need and what the trees need, and of course what the forage needs too, which is often good grazing management and enough sunlight. But it's gonna, if somebody calls me up and says, hey, what are the best trees to plant on my farm in Alabama or something, I might be able to answer that only because we're probably planting the same trees on our ranch in Argentina, but forages would be a more challenging question. And there I think you need to try to find the closer to home expertise for that. Long story short, you can find me just by searching for my name or Cornell Forestry or Cornell Silvopasture, and I'm happy to talk to people.
And we'll get some of those links in our show notes. Before we go today, Brett, do you have a question for me?
I do. I asked you one earlier, but I'm not going to ask that one again. It was about your barn floor digging experience, and what on earth made you think that was a good idea? I think, here's my question to you, Cal. You're a farmer, and a sizable one at that, from what I can tell. What on earth, and I don't know that, you've probably answered this before, but I don't, if you have, I don't remember what your answer was, but what on earth caused you and these other great podcast hosts, but you can answer it in your own context. I'm sure you get a little bit of money out of the podcasting, but it's a whole big labor of love. And I know that you started this kind of during the COVID shutdown period, but like you just thought to yourself, gee, I need more time to keep myself busy, so I think I'll start a podcast series. But in as short or long of an answer as you want to give, what really was the moment that you thought, hey, I need to do a podcast on regenerative farming?
The thing that struck me that caused me to start down this journey was I was slow to the podcast world, but when I started listening to podcasts, I was like, this is great. I can listen in the car, I can listen everywhere. It's a little bit later, I've done audiobooks, and I really enjoy audiobooks, but the podcasting, and I'd listen to the the podcasts that were out there, Working Cows and some others out there. And one thing I noticed that I wanted that I didn't feel was out there all the time. I know Clay talks to producers different times, but he also has a lot of experts. And I really wanted to talk to other people that were doing it. And when I looked around my county, my area, I didn't even know where to go find someone to talk to that was doing it. So then, discovering podcasts, I'm like, this is a way, a very selfish way, to talk to people who's doing it and doing a great job. Because now I can call them, email them, I can have a conversation with them about this because I have a podcast. And then, so it opened doors. When I had Will Harris on the podcast in, I don't know, I want to say episode 18 through 20, somewhere through there, I hate to admit, I didn't know how big a deal he was until after I had him scheduled. I just emailed him and they're like, we got it set up. And then I start researching for the episode more and I'm like, oh dear, what did I get myself into? But just all these opportunities to talk to people. And then, as I mentioned, I hope our listeners get benefit out of this. And I know they do because I have people that message me and say they do. But I doubt anyone gets as much good or as much benefit out of these podcasts as I do. It's affected what I do in practice. It's affected my thinking. It's opened my eyes to things I didn't consider before. So it does take time. I do make a little bit of money. Not enough, but I make a little bit. And it's been tremendously valuable for me, and I wish I'd started years before.
I'm grateful that you and others are doing this because I found it to be by far the most accessible way that I can not just learn a lot of very helpful and very interesting new stuff, but really get that like almost weekly refreshment of inspiration for what I'm doing.
Right.
And it's you've done a particularly good job of seeking out. I think several of your recent interviewees are like not very far from where you are, and I think we all mistakenly think there's these supermodels out there of how we should farm that are several states over, and yet sometimes we have it right next door to us, and it's really helped raise the visibility of a lot of good examples and even role models for how we can do a better job, all do a better job as regenerative farmers and on our own farms, regardless of the scale or the location or the type of animals that we may have or the rainfall that we may have. Yeah.
Thank you. And as I do the podcast, I want these stories to speak to our listener. And so our listeners all have a story that speaks to them. We got to get guests from all over, all different sizes, all different backgrounds, because I want the listener to hear themselves in the story and then take their next step.
Now you've had a New Yorker on your podcast. I don't know if you've had any New Yorkers.
I don't think I've had one from your area.
I should also add that we've always said our farm is open to anybody that wants to show up. People just need to get a hold of us ahead of time to make sure we're actually around. So we largely enjoy having others come here. And a lot of this stuff that we've talked about today, it's easier for me to show somebody than it is explain to them in an email or over the phone. We do host quite a few tour groups here every year, and we'll even have the NRCS Eastern Grazing specialists here for a short course in early June this year, and I'm looking forward to exposing them to silvopasturing and bale grazing and outwintering and things that I think NRCS should pay more attention to, but we'll see what they think of it after we give them a heavy dose of it.
I hope it goes well for you. Brett, really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us today.
Very good. Thank you, Cal. Appreciate it.
I appreciate Brett spending time with us today. If you are setting on woodland acres and haven't seriously considered silvopasture, hopefully this conversation got the wheels turning. Brett mentioned his 10-question site evaluation tool. We have the link to it in the show notes, along with his Cornell Extension contact information. He's also open to visitors at Angus Glen Farms. Just reach out ahead of time. If today's episode was useful to you, share it with another farmer or rancher who might benefit. And if you haven't already, leave us a review. It goes a long ways towards helping other producers find the show. Thank you for listening to the Grazing Grass Podcast, where grass farmers learn from grass farmers. More grass, better soil, happier livestock. Keep on grazing, and I'll see you next episode.